Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome to the third week of the course Elements of Literature and Creative Communication. During the last 2 weeks, we have had an interesting discussion on the origins of literature, and in the second week we discussed various ways through which we can read a literary text. In this week, we are going to focus on poetry, So as part of that, we can call this week Poetry, a Tryst with Imagination. In the first class, we are going to discuss the origins of poetry, how does poetry begin with. Of course, any linguistic activity that you can trace human civilization back to must have been really poetic. At its source, we have already discussed this, language at its source is generally poetic. Therefore, any significant linguistic activity of human beings must have also been poetic. And generally speaking, literature, be it poetry or drama or any other forms of literature, it has its oral roots. Before writing system was invented and literature was coded in that system, literature was basically a medium of expression. Medium of expression, when I say an oral medium of expression, all right. So, keeping that broad perspective in mind, let us go ahead and see and take a closer look at the origins of poetry. So, here I have with me an interesting poem. Before we discuss what are the origins of poetry, what are the sources of poetry, let me read this brilliant short excerpt, and later maybe I will connect you with why I chose to begin this lecture by reading this poem. So, you can call this excerpt The Exaltation of Inanna. It is an excerpt from a larger work. We are going to discuss that work in a short while. Though I bore the offering basket, though I chanted the hymns, a death offering was ready. Was I no longer living? I went towards light, it felt scorching to me. I went towards shade, it shrouded me in swirling dust. A slobbered hand was laid across my honeyed mouth. What was fairest in my nature was turned to dirt. O moon god Swayam, is this Luglani my destiny? Tell heaven to set me free of it. Just say it to heaven. Heaven will set me free. The Almighty Queen, who presides over the priestly congregation, she accepted her prayer. Inanna's sublime will was for her restoration. She was lovely as a moonbeam streaming down. To you, who can destroy countries, whose cosmic powers are bestowed by heaven, to my queen arrayed in beauty, to Inanna be praise. We have every reason to begin our discussion of the origins of poetry with this particular piece, because you would be surprised if I tell you that what you heard just now is probably one of the most ancient poetic pieces that human history has discovered. In other words, what you have read just now, what you have heard just now, is probably the first known poetic work attributed to a writer in the entire human history. Who is this writer? What is this work? We will get to know in a short while, but meanwhile, though it is the first of the known literary pieces attributed to a writer, it is very easily 4,500 years old poetic piece. Look at its beauty, look at its elegance, look at how beautifully lines flow. Of course, we have access to it only through translation, but translation, let's remember, does not add anything more than what is already there. So even through this translation, the poetic beauty, the poetic genius of the writer is quite evident. And let's remember, this work is at least 4,500 years old. Going ahead, let's quickly take a look at how poetry began. We have already discussed in one of our introductory classes that poetry is a form of verbal art. Okay, it's a representation of one's inner feelings, emotions and experiences using the medium of language, using the medium of words. Therefore, it's a verbal form. The earliest form of poetry did not exist in written form. This we already know, because poetry, like any other significant linguistic activity, has its origins in the oral traditions of human history. Therefore, you have an oral background to poetry. It began as as part of orality in that human history, or in the history of human evolution. So during the earlier times, ancient times, poetry, when it was not written, how was it passed on? It was learned, it was sung, basically recited, sung. Most of the times literature before the invention of the writing system is folklorish, in the sense it's the collective property of an entire race or culture that produced it. Therefore, we do not exactly know who has authored a particular piece. Okay, so it belongs to the collective wisdom of a culture, the collective repertoire of a culture. So poetry served various purposes during those times. Poetry, of course, predominantly it was meant as a medium of pleasure and enjoyment. It had to be learnt, sung, recited, and thus passed on from generation to generation. So whenever there was a religious occasion, an historical moment, or something that needs to be even instructed, or something that needs to be recorded, all this happened using the medium of poetry. Therefore, poetry, while serving the need to create pleasure, need to create enjoyment, also acted as a tool, as a custodian to pass on the ethos of a particular culture from generation to generation. So it was also used as a medium to pass on information, knowledge, belief systems and things like that. That's where you have the origin of poetry. Okay. So therefore, many of the songs that we sing, many of the hymns that we raise to God today, many of our prayers have been passed on to us like that. Even our epics, the so-called epics that we keep reading today, that we keep going back to, for all our practical needs and philosophical needs, they were also, first they also appeared in oral tradition as oral poetry, as oral epics. Okay. So sometimes, as we said, it's a part of narrated history, it's a kind of an invented tale. It's a way to, it's an instruction manual wherein you get to know how to lead a life. All this happened through an oral medium. Well, this is where we arrive at the concept of nomic poetry. In fact, nomic, the word nomic has Greek origins. That means, earlier, let's say during between 8th and 5th century BC, okay, in Greece, nomic poetry was popular. So here poetry again was used as a way to memorize things, because, well, those of you know some skills of memorizing. You know it very well, right? When you, whatever you need to memorize, if you do it taking the help of rhythmic patterns of sounds or rhythmic patterns of words, then it's going to remain in your memory for a longer time. You would be committing to your memory if you commit it first to the rhythmic sequence of language. So nomic poetry was used for that. Through the help of nomic poetry, many things were passed on. So afterwards, it's only later that poetry was carved onto monoliths or rune stones and steles, and even written on papyrus and other modes. So nomic poetry slightly predates appearance of poetry on stone edicts, monoliths and rune stones. All right. This is where we can connect our first slide with. The first slide that discusses an extract from one of the ancient written works, one of the ancient works, works of poetry, is written by the Sumerian priestess Enheduanna. She lived during 23rd century BC, approximately 4400 years ago or 4500 years ago. She is not just the first known woman poet, but also the first known author in the entire human history. The poem that we read in the beginning of this class was written by Enheduanna. In Sumerian, it meant high priestess or darling of the heaven, something like that. Enheduanna she was a daughter of the king of Akkad, Sargau of Akkad, who ruled during 2300 BC. Okay. She has left an indelible mark not just on Sumerian literature, but on on the entire world literature itself. The collection of her poems is now available to us as the Sumerian temple hymns, and the poem that we read in the beginning is an excerpt from there. She seemed to have composed about 42 hymns scattered across several stone tablets now that are available to us. Her works are known as Ininsagura, Ninmesara and Inimehusa, which you can translate as the great-hearted mistress, the exaltation of Inanna. Of course, the first slide was an excerpt from this particular work, and the third one is the goddess of the fearsome powers. So, as human history knows it, she is the first known author in the entire world history. That's where we can call her the high priestess of poetry. Looking at her influence and studying her influence on the literatures of other world cultures, Paul Kruvazek, author of Babylon, a known historian and a journalist, he writes, her compositions, though not only rediscovered in modern times, they remained models of petitionary prayer for centuries together. Because you please recall the first slide, it was a kind of a fervent prayer to goddess Inanna. When an individual feels helpless against the forces that she can't see, her only recourse is to her Ishtadevata, or the divine force that she believes in. So, as a last resort, you find in that prayer Enheduanna making a devoted prayer to her goddess and requesting her, almost urging her to come out of her heavenly seat and rescue her and restore her. And later, of course, the second part of the poem that you read shows how effective her prayer was. As a result of her prayers, the goddess herself comes and blesses her and restores her to her original glory and power and position. Okay. Therefore, her poetry serves as a kind of template for petitionary prayers. When we say petitionary prayers, all our works are some kind of prayers, whether it is in ancient Greece, ancient China, or even in ancient India. Why? Even our Rigvedic chants, our Vedic chants, all these things are our prayers. Our prayers put in the form of a verse, put in the form of poetry. So her work acts as a kind of a template for the later cultures to follow and compose their own prayers, psalms and hymns. So that's her influence. Through them, faint echoes of in Hedwana, the first named literary author in history, we can even hear the hymns of early Christian church. Even the hymns of early Christian church, they owe a lot to the prayers of Enheduanna. And this is, as she herself writes, this is again an excerpt from what she writes after having completed. This is how she ends her book. The compiler of this tablet is Enheduanna. My king, something has been created that no one has created before. This is how she ends her book, the book of prayers, the Sumerian temple hymns. Something that nobody has created in the history before. So she creates a kind of a torchbearer for human literature. Moving ahead from that Sumerian cultural piece to the river banks of the Nile, the African civilization, the Egyptian civilization. Okay. So this is again the roots of poetry in Egypt. So including, a broad term could be African civilizations. They flowered in the river valley empires of Nile, Niger and Volta rivers. So here they created hunting poetry or panegyric court poetry and even elegiac poetry. Panegyric court poetry is praising the king, praising the patrons who have provided shelter to the poets and all that. And elegiac poetry, of course, sad songs. We are going to discuss these different subtypes of poetry in our subsequent classes, but for time being we need to know that elegiac poetry deals with sad songs, we can call them, and panegyric, praiseworthy, praise songs, songs of praise. The earliest written poetry of Africa is found in the pyramid texts. They are called the pyramid texts. These are the later names that we have given them. Please remember, earlier they were written using different names, and they were scattered across different stone edicts and stone tablets and other places. And now we have collected them together and call them pyramid texts. Pyramid texts are also called funeral prayers. Please remember, where have we got this? How do we know? Where were these pyramid texts written? How have we received them? The pyramid texts were written in the pyramids, especially if you can see the pyramid there. On the inner walls of the pyramid, we first discovered these pyramid texts, and we believe that they must have been written somewhere during 27th century BC and 21st or 22nd century BC, a rough timeline. Please remember, these are not exact lines, and there is a huge gap between them, at least some 500 years. So we can't exactly pinpoint the date of their composition, but this must have been a broad period in which they must have been written. So, they were inscribed on the inner walls of the pyramids at Saqqara. It's a village in the Giza region. Giza region is well known for pyramids of Egyptian kings and pharaohs. So, in one of those pyramids we discovered these pyramid texts, and they are religious documents, in the sense they are religious prayers. They are mortuary prayers, you can call them, or hymns, including some mantras or spells that were intended to protect the pharaoh and ensure life and sustenance even after their death. So, the Book of the Dead that we hear have their origins in these kind of the pyramid texts. So, this is where we can find African civilization expressing its earlier poetic expressions, through pyramid texts. Going ahead, we have another interesting literary piece, again from the same region. It's called the Epic of Sundayata. It's an oral historical epic. All right. So, this is again from the region of Africa. It's an epic poem of the Malinke people, and it tells the story of our hero Sundayata Keita. It belongs to the genre of poetry called historical poetry or historical epic, an oral historical epic. And in fact, look at the superscript, we are vessels of speech which harbor secrets many centuries old. Here, human beings are called vessels of speech. So, it is a kind of a beautiful metonymy, it is a figure of speech. Again, we are going to discuss many of these figures of speeches in our subsequent classes, but look at how beautifully human beings are called. We are vessels of speech, and what do? We harbor secrets many centuries old. In fact, here human beings have been called vessels through which secrets, divine secrets, secrets of life, they are passed on from generation to generation. How beautifully it's felt. This is a quote from that particular text. Sunandaita Keita, who was a prince and founder of Mali Empire that seemed to have existed in West Africa somewhere between 1230 to 1670 BC. Okay. So, roughly about 3,300 years or 3,500 years, something like that. So, but there are a lot of debates in the scholarly circles. There are debates concerning whether Sunandaita was an actual historical figure or whether it's just a fictitious tale, whether he's a fictional hero, whether he was a fictional hero. Leaving aside these debates, what we can safely say is that it belongs to an oral historical narrative. Nevertheless, it provides us an insight into the socio-political, cultural life of the Mali kingdom and also the Mande ethnic group in West Africa, Mande ethnic group in West Africa. This is something that we have to keep in mind. The Epic of Sundayata in that sense is one of the precursors of an oral historical epic, and later probably it takes on the form of historical epics. Of course, we have already discussed this. So, it paves the template for other historical epics to for composition. Apart from the pyramid texts and the tale of Sundayata, African poetry is basically performative. The early African poetry, of course, poetry in general itself is performative, but early African poetry was basically performative, like the early poetry in other generations or in other cultures such as ancient India, ancient Greece, ancient Mesopotamian cultures. It was performative in nature. It's rooted in theatrics, and again it serves various socio-cultural purposes, political purposes. It's meant as a tool of education, spiritual purposes, entertainment reasons. So they would gather together maybe around a campfire and go on, reciting poems after poems, thereby entertaining people around, passing on the wisdom of lore. So that's how these are certain oral origins of poetry that we can keep in mind. Whenever such performances took place, remember these songs were accompanied by musical instruments such as drums, cymbals and other things. So that's we need to know, this is a part of performance. Earlier poetry was not just poetic, it was, as we said, it was a part of an entire show, an entire performance was done through this. So even before the form of drama was introduced, poetry served the purpose of drama, poetry served the purpose of novel. So poetry was the be all and the end all of literature. Therefore it was much more comprehensive than we know the term poetry today. So these are some vignettes, vignettes into the origin of poetry. Especially in this class we have covered the origins of poetry, especially in the context of Mesopotamian culture, Sumerian culture and Egyptian culture and African cultures. And we have also come face to face with the first known author that is available in human history. We have even read excerpts from her work and how her work exerts an enormous amount of influence on other writers later and even on other cultures and other traditions. In the next class we are going to discuss origins of poetry in the other parts of the globe. Maybe we can even go to ancient China, and even we can discuss the origins of poetry in India and other places. All right, thank you. See you in the next class.